Hello, hello. Welcome everybody to an hour of muddy science. We are talking about stuff which makes up the seafloor and which covers most of it, and that is actually sediment. It's not rocks. And you might say, ooh, why do I want to know about that? Well, you want to know about that because this is what real science can look like. And you might say, ooh, I want to become a marine biologist and study cool sharks and whales and gannets and turtles. There's a fly. Maybe you study flies as a zoologist. But not necessarily this kind of muddy feast here. Well, the reality is, I hate to disappoint you, this was my very first exposure on the very first day of taking a deep sea sample. You can see there was a bit of a rock slip up here, but we towed a big beam trawl and it just filled itself completely up with mud. And this is something which repeated itself day after day after day after day. In the middle of the Pacific, that was between Fiji and Tonga. Never mind, that is the reality. And so you might say, ooh, this is not so much for me. Well, let me show you two videos from our friends from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which very nicely illustrate how exciting life on mud in the deep sea can be. The first one actually deals with a sponge which eats other animals. It's a carnivorous sponge on the deep sea floor.
Scientists from the California Academy of Sciences, the University of Victoria, the Koyatan Marine Laboratory, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute recently described an extraordinary new species of carnivorous sponge named Chondrocladia lyra, or the harp sponge. Rather than filtering water for food, as most sponges do, carnivorous sponges ensnare tiny animals with Velcro-like hooks and spines. The sponges then envelop and digest their prey. Enclosed and partially digested crustacean prey were observed embedded in the tissues of the sponges we collected for this study. Ambari's remotely operated vehicles, Tiburon and Doc Ricketts, were used to collect 2 specimens of the new sponge. We used these specimens, along with video observations of 10 other individuals, to describe the unique morphology of this sponge and to characterize the habitat and environment where it lives. These sponges were observed on the deep sea floor off the coast of California. They live on soft, muddy sediment at depths of 3,300 to 3,500 meters, where environmental conditions, including food sources, are extremely stable. The harp sponge anchors itself into the soft sediment with a root-like structure called a rhizoid. Other organisms, including anemones and sea cucumbers, were observed near the harp sponges. We named this unique animal a harp sponge because the shape of the vein and the vertically aligned branches resembles a harp. Like sea fan corals, we think the harp sponge evolved into this shape to maximize the surface area that is exposed to prevailing currents. This increased surface area probably helps the sponge capture prey and release its eggs and sperm into passing ocean currents. The first specimens we encountered showed only 2 veins. However, additional observations revealed that the harp sponge often has multiple veins. Up to 6 have been observed, and these all radiate from the center of the organism. The upright branches of each vein typically end in a swollen ball, which is where packets of sperm are produced and released. When sperm packets released from other, nearby sponges are captured on egg development sites of the vertical branches, the area becomes swollen as the fertilized eggs mature. In addition to studying the new sponge's morphological characters and ecology, we used powerful microscopes to describe the shape and size of species-specific structural elements called spicules. Close examination and description of spicules is essential to species identification in sponges. Our observations suggest that a related species of sponge may occur in deep waters of the South Atlantic. This unique discovery aids in our understanding of carnivorous sponge biology.
So here you go, this is rather unique, a carnivorous sponge on a deep sea sediment plain. And if you think life in the deep sea is constant,
Scientists from the California Academy of Sciences
covering more than 70% of the planet's surface, the ocean surrounds us and is essential to life. However, it also contains the most remote and least understood habitats on Earth. The majority of the ocean is very deep and remains largely unexplored. This is because of the difficulties working in such a harsh environment. In the mid-17th century, some researchers concluded that the deep sea was azoic, showing no traces of life. Part of this assumption was based on the lack of a food supply. With no light available down deep, food can't be produced through photosynthesis, as it is in shallow water. Perhaps because it was so unimaginable, the idea of a lifeless sea persisted, even in the face of evidence provided by earlier explorers who recovered remarkable animals like the spasmodium from deep water. With the advent of major research voyages, such as the 4-year-long Challenger expedition, our understanding of life in the deep sea increased tremendously. Yet it would be nearly another century before technology allowed us to begin to visualize these remote ecosystems. Newer technologies, such as remotely operated submarines, reveal what was previously hidden. The deep sea actually contains a variety of remarkable habitats that support rich biological communities. We now know that even in the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, there is life. Crustaceans and other species live nearly 7 miles down. As our vehicles descend into the ocean, light fades quickly. Temperatures drop to just above freezing, and the weight of the water above results in immense pressure. The vast abyssal area spans depths of 3,000 to 6,000 meters and comprises 76% of the entire ocean floor. Off the coast of California, researchers have studied an abyssal area for the past 24 years. Long thought to be a constant, unchanging environment, well isolated from changes taking place in the upper ocean, we now know that these areas can be dynamic and that the ecological changes there are linked to what is happening at the ocean's surface and in fact our whole global biosphere. We've learned that animals living in the abyss survive on organic matter created in shallow water that floats downward. Small bits of dead animals and single-celled marine algae make their way to the seafloor, providing food for other organisms that filter it out of the water or extract it from mud on the bottom. Fluctuations in the number of animals on the seafloor are tied to the amount of organic matter falling from above. The changes we saw in the latter part of the study were quite dramatic. In 2006, there was no obvious organic matter observed on the seafloor, and there were mostly immobile, filter-feeding animals living there. The number and types of animals stayed this way for some time, even during 2007, when we saw an increasing amount of organic matter on the seafloor. By 2009, the debris was no longer there, presumably having been eaten. Within 2 years, the biological community changed dramatically. Now, large numbers of sea cucumbers dominated the seafloor. More dramatic changes took place in 2012. In March, we saw salt bloom. Salts are gelatinous animals that are most abundant in surface waters and whose numbers are known to increase rapidly. Over the next 2 months, many of them drifted downward. Certain types of seafloor animals capable of taking advantage of this extra food thrived, becoming more abundant than at any other time in this 24-year study. Other animals, such as sponges, became clogged and died. Our understanding of the deep sea is dependent on the development of technology. Autonomous vehicles like our benthic rover can move along the seabed, measuring how much food is consumed and how much is stored in the sediments for use by animals when less is raining down from above. Time-lapse cameras allow us to monitor the biological community and document food falls continuously for up to 1 year at a time. These types of long-term studies are essential for monitoring future ocean changes. This is Linda Coons for the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute.
Right. So I think just this little glimpse into deep sea biology on a muddy seafloor should have convinced most of you that life is quite wondrous. and often unknown. So you don't have to necessarily be on a rock. As a matter of fact, if you take a big view of the ocean, only very few areas look like this. This is actually at the spreading center where new rock is being created at a mid-Atlantic ridge. And yes, there's only a slight dusting of rocks, of sediment here, essentially because it's very young. So sediment didn't have time to accumulate there yet. However, in many other parts of the world, it looks like this. This is in the middle of the Pacific, and lots of biologically produced mud. Those are basically the skeletons of organisms. Now, sediments, people say like, it's just mud, so it actually is of no use to anybody, really. Well, the first thing you have to actually realize is it's different particles. There are usually more than one source, contributing to it. In terms of where it comes from, it can be either inorganic, like weathering of rocks from the land being washed in by rivers, or it can be organic, which basically means some of the fleshy remains of organisms whose skeletons contribute to the sediments originally. But all sediments have one thing in common: they're malleable, they're pliable, they move, they change because they are loose. We call this unconsolidated, right? So sediments are unconsolidated, but they are so because they lack the long-term geological forces to compact them. Now, we have already seen, life on the deep sea floor. Here you get actually an urchin cruising around. Here we got a quantity of fish. This is a time-snap camera. You can watch this in your own time. I've got the link at the bottom here. So one thing we also learned over the last 20, 30 years is, image technology became more available, became better. We could use it in more locations. Is that the deep sea is not free of the forces which shape sediment somewhere else. I.e., here you got current ripples at about 4,000 meters near Antarctica, which is actually very, very remarkable. We will talk a little bit more like how much sediment we have, but I'll just give you this as a little pointer here, a teaser. This is a basically undersea mountain, a seamount. The flank coming down here, you got a little bit of a little bit of a scar here, and then we have this massive wedge of sediment covering about the first 1.8 kilometers of that mountain. Now let's just think about it. We kind of get a little bit excited here on the Sunshine Coast if you have a mountain of a few hundred meters, right? Like Mount Coulomb, which is hardly a hill in deep sea science. Pardon me. And here we got about 1.8 kilometers of mud. And this is actually a fairly tiny deposit, because in many parts of the world we actually get up to 9 kilometers of mud. So yes, our sediments everywhere. Most of the ocean floor consists of muddy, sandy, silty particles, and the only areas which are free is the top of undersea mountains like seamounts, where currents sweep the strong currents sweep the sediment off, or very young seafloor near spreading centers, or when hot water dissolves some of the settled material. But those are really exceptions, by and large. Now, because sediments are so prominent, this is what might look a very boring classification, but if your first job is in environmental consultancy, and for many of you that will be the bread and butter, I can almost guarantee that it will have something to do with sedimentary features. And you quite often actually use this kind of classification. We're talking about pebbles, we're talking about granules, and so forth. So the official name for anything smaller than 60 3 micrometers is mud. Here we got a thing called a consumable item. I think it's called a student, and disappearing in the mud. Then we move on. Anything up to 2 millimeters is sand. 2 millimeters is actually really the upper size class boundary here, because it's quite coarse. You might say, oh, 2 millimeters is not actually very much. Well, on our beaches, our meaning the Sunshine Coast, the average diameter of a sand grain is roughly about, well, I know it exactly, it's 353 micrometers out of many thousands of measurements. Now, when I did some poking around on the internet to, look for videos about sand, I came across this one. And this is some crazy guy who said, oh, I invented a 3D microscope, and what I can do is show you some sand grains. And what is actually truly astonishing is that that every beach seems to have a very unique composition in terms of what the sand grains look like. Here you see a classic quartz. This is quite weathered. You see how rounded it is? So it must have actually been swashing around for quite a long time. Here this is actually much fresher in the Grand Canyon, no surprise there. Another beach sand here, here's a foraminifera, here's basaltic rock. So there is more to sand grains, or to a collection of particles, than just a basically collection of innate geological objects. Here we got a foraminifera. Now this is a bryozoan, probably skeleton, and so forth and so forth. So if you really want to completely relax, oh, those are foraminiferas. Isn't that kind of really cool, the star sand? I think it's very cool. So he likes to be going to Hawaii. But if you're really bored and you want to actually watch a lot of sand, you can also watch the cheddar cheese, basically maturing facility. That's also extremely cheddar cheesy TV. It's kind of interesting stuff, but it's just about in the same league of being kind of very esoteric. Now, here is the web link to it. You can also hire this guy for talks. Got flowers, food, the body, and so forth. Very. As we actually move up, we get into granules up to 4 millimeters. Then pebbles, they go up to about 64 millimeters, and then everything up to about that much is called cobbles, and everything larger than about 1/4 of a meter is boulders. So there are official classifications, and you have to use the correct term. It takes a little bit of experience, particularly when it comes to things like cobbles, which we actually think are in normal day usage a little bit bigger, but there are official terms for each of those. Right. Now, why are we so obsessed when we talk about sediment, about particle size? The reason for that is actually quite simple, and that has to do with the settling velocity. Settling velocity is crucially important because it connects the shallow parts of the oceans with the big ones through the settling of particles, through the rain of particles going from shallow sunlit areas to the deep ocean and ultimately forming the bottom of the deep ocean. Now, why do smaller particles sink so much slower than bigger ones? It has to do with the ratio between gravitational force and friction of a body. I got my diforge here. So think about, this is actually a particle. As it actually goes through the water, it actually bounces between water molecules. It has to basically displace them. Now that displacement means the molecule rubs against the water molecules. They might say, well, gravitational attraction is actually pulling it down. Well, the gravitational attraction depends on the weight, which depends on the volume of the organism. Now let's suppose you are a very small particle, like a silt or a clay one. You might actually take up to about 50 years, if nothing happens to you, to basically sink from 0 meters to 4,000 meters, which is the average depth of the ocean. Now why is that? It's quite simple really, because as you actually have a smaller body volume, the ratio of your body volume increases disproportionately to the surface area. So a smaller particle has a much larger surface area, which basically means surface area is friction, whereas volume means gravitational force pulling you down. In other words, you are at a disadvantage the smaller you get as a particle, because you're missing out on weight, but you're actually increasing your surface area in relation to the little bit of weight you still have. The upshot of it is that essentially small particles sink very slowly, extremely slowly, because their surface area, i.e. their frictional potential, is actually so large. Now, this is quite funny. I was like, how can I, illustrate? Oh, it doesn't really come. Where is it? Come on. Can we poke it out? No. No. Never mind. That is actually just supposed to actually show you a turbulent water flow, but it doesn't really want to play. What actually happens is, when you have a very turbulent water flow, particles stay in suspension. They never have a chance to settle out, and basically we have an expression for that, and it is turbid waters. Turbid waters is basically any solution of very fine particles where turbulence keeps them from settling out. Now, this is a very famous, or should I say infamous diagram, because if you're an environmental consultant or any other marine biologist having to do with particles, you come back to that a lot. Why do you come back to that a lot? Because it is for you the relationship between whether a particle remains in suspension, whether it settles out and hence the water becomes clearer, or whether it's actually transported in a large or a small distance. Now, all of those are very, very important considerations when it comes to environmental protection safeguards for building projects, civil engineering, and so forth and so forth. Now, you can actually read that thing in two ways. You can say, okay, I have, let's say, a very coarse sand of 1 millimeter, and you then actually can say, as long as my current stays under 100 millimeters per second, that sediment will actually settle out. It will become, a deposit on the seafloor. If it's slightly higher, it will actually be transported, and if it's even slightly higher, the flow velocity, it will actually remove it, it will erode it away. You can actually also say then, well, if I want to avoid, any increase in turbidity given my sediment, I should really have flow velocities well below that blue line. A very practical measure you can actually adopt, let's say, on a building project. So this is enormously useful. If you don't really like reading diagrams, and I think you need to get into the habit of actually doing it, I can actually cut it down to a few very, very basic observations, and they are essentially large particles will usually be deposited closer to their source, i.e. they don't actually travel very far for a given current speed. Fine particles on the other hand, are transported over longer distances, i.e. they move far out into the sea once they get released from the land. You can also go and look at a particular habitat and can basically tell from the type of sediment you find there what the current situation or the current conditions in terms of maximum current speeds usually are. If you go, let's say, to a beach with very coarse sediment, you can be fairly sure or fairly certain that sediment is coarse for the simple reason because all the fine particles have been removed, meaning currents are strong. If you go to a low energy environment, you can tell if the sediment is very fine, that currents are sluggish, because even fine particles can actually settle out there and will not on average be removed, eroded away from that area. So sediment coarseness or fineness or particle size, whatever you want to actually call it, gives you a very, very good time integrated measure of the energy conditions impacting on the sea floor. Now, here is a video of a sandstorm, and you might say, ooh, Schlacher now completely lost it. Why do I show you a video of a sandstorm? The reason is, this is, believe it or not, one of the significant sources of sediment being supplied to the oceans. It's a mechanism of transport from the land to the sea. How does that work? Well, look at a satellite picture. Here we go. This is the Iberian Peninsula, well, cut off really, just in the Extremadura here. This is Portugal, there's Galicia. Then we go down here to the Straits of Gibraltar. This is Morocco, Mauritania, Senegal, and so forth. And you can see this massive dust storm moving off from the Sahara into the North Atlantic. Look at this size of the sediment plume. Those are millions of tons of sand being transported from the land to the sea. So this is one of the transport processes, and it gives you an indication of where the main sources of sediment might lie. Broadly speaking, we differentiate or we distinguish 4 different types of sediments. You can say, well, we do know that even the Himalayan peaks, will not stand forever. In 2 billion years of time, they will actually be fairly hilly, insignificant things because they will have just weathered away. And that erosion of the land supplying rivers with sand, and then ultimately as the sand becomes melted down into smaller particles of silt and clay, that is one of the big sources of sediment to the ocean. So basically the land is crumbling away. That's why you shouldn't actually study terrestrial ecology, and making the oceans richer in sediment. A little bit comes from volcanic eruptions or from wind-blown dust, as I have just shown you. The other major source of sediment are biogenous sediments. And basically, every cubic meter of seawater will contain thousands and thousands and thousands of unicellular little organisms called phytoplankton. Some of them are zooplankton, but never mind about the distinction right here now. But essentially, they build, unseen to the naked eye, you need a microscope to actually have a look at it, quite exquisite skeletons. And those skeletons come in all different shapes, forms, sizes, and so forth. And when the organism dies or gets eaten by a zooplanktonic organism, such as a copepod coming along or a little fish, essentially they sink to the bottom of the sea. And the skeletons form sediment. They're particles. Now, it just happens to be the case for us, we are a very curious species, because engineering-wise, we power ourselves forward through controlled explosions which are fueled by the organic remains of those organisms. What do I mean? if large quantities of those biogenous sediments settle out to the bottom of the ocean, their organic remains can be so large that they form oil and gas reserves under the right conditions. And we basically pump them up, and voila, we use them in internal combustion engines, which is basically just burning dinosaurs or thousands and thousands per minute of the organic remains of those organisms. We have a very special class of sediments called the hydrogenous ones, and that is basically chemicals forming crystals or other curious bodies, and we get to that in a second. And that actually happens as a direct chemical reaction from seawater, sometimes under evaporative conditions, such as in a very shallow lagoon in a hot climate, or we use them basically to make salt. And last but not least, we all have to be a little bit mad to be a scientist, so I often blame it on cosmogenous sediments. And that is basically, as we sit here, we are continually being rained upon by a steady supply of fairy dust from stellar space. We got micro meteorites, but it's basically all sort of debris from space falling onto the Earth. Now the volumes, of course, of cosmogenous sediments are not very large. Thanks good for that. But they are there, so we can't really ignore them. Now, when it comes to land-borne sediments, the originous ones, we don't have to look very, very far to basically spot how the process works. This is Mooloolaba here. This is a photo I took from a little plane. Here's the boats coming back on a Sunday afternoon. And you see this huge sediment plume coming out of the Mooloolaba River. Now that sediment would have come from somewhere up from Maleni Carnivorous, probably up that way, or the catchments further down to the coast, or where all the suburbs are being built, but we can't really say that. And essentially it gets washed out to sea. Most of it actually settles out on a continental shelf here, but some of it will actually be transported further offshore, mostly to fall off into the abyssal plains located about 20 kilometers offshore from the coast here. Rivers transport large volumes of quartz sand into nearshore oceans, but also they transport fine, small clay particles. They are smaller than 4 micrometers, which basically means they can travel hundreds to thousands of kilometers right into the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the amount of sediment reaching the global ocean every year is staggering. Think about the figure now, 15 billion tons per year. It's incredible. If you think about that, the Earth has existed for 4 billion years or something around there. To have that massive amount of particles coming from the land delivered to the ocean every singular year is mind-blowing. Flamboyantly mind-blowing. Now you can also, poke around the internet, hunt for images of river blooms, and there is plenty of them. It doesn't really matter where you go. Here is one from southern Spain. Here is one from New Zealand. No sheep here. There must be some around the farmyard here. Transporting half of the island straight out into the ocean. And of course we know a little bit about that because a few years ago we ran quite a big project on the land-ocean coupling being achieved. Here one coming out from the Mooloolaba, and those are all blooms coming out from the Maruchi River. And notice how incredibly distinct they are. They don't actually mix very readily, and that is actually a consequence of density differences, mostly as a result of lower salinity. Now we already talked about the sand being transported by sandstorms from deserts. Here is another example of one of those massive sandstorms. Here's the Canary Island. This is West Africa going off into the North Atlantic. Now, a few years ago, oops, we had a very large volcanic eruption in Iceland, and that delivered massive amounts of particles into the atmosphere to the extent that it basically led to long-term, I think it lasted for half a year, disruptions of the European, North European flight segments. It also basically was the case in Bali when we had that. So over many months, we actually saw that atmospheric loads of particles being too high for safe operation of aircraft. Eventually they cleared, of course, the skies cleared, and they cleared because the particles settled out, and many of them would have landed up in the oceans. Aha, there we go. Now, a few years ago when I did this lecture, until I should say literally about 2 days ago, adjust the camera, sorry. It was a case where I said, look, it is kind of curious that we have little fires in Australia, and you could see those streaks, right, of more or less dust, wandering over to New Zealand. Now, that actually has changed very dramatically since, we had those massive bushfires in New South Wales and Victoria. And you look at this imagery, and it is literally frightening. And it is frightening not only displayed over how many thousands of kilometers one can actually feel an influence or an impact of those bushfires. Look at this top right image here, where the plume basically goes up and settles all the way over the northern part of the North Island of New Zealand. But also, you can actually be a little bit of a, maybe a Liberal Party supporter. You have to be quite careful what I say now, like Thomas. I didn't say anything. I said you could be. And even if you would be, sitting in Parliament holding a lump of coal, and you might not actually read your dossiers, but just look at this imagery, and I think if you still then actually go on and deny our children's generation a safe and secure climate to live in, I think you must actually be a little bit blind even to powerful imagery like that. And it's quite odd that nowadays we find ourselves learning about ocean sediments and talking about bushfires. Who would have thought about that? I would have never thought about that, about 10, 20 years ago. But that actually illustrates how very, very acute the need for climate action is. Right. And here's another, image here. Look at this massive, smoke clouds, and they're actually full of very, very fine particles going into the ocean. Now, some of the coolest sediments, come from the remains of organisms. Now, what you can do is you can literally scoop up, a little timber of, beach sand, and then put it on the microscope and use a very, very fine needle, and you can sort them out, and you will find all those little remains. This is mostly foraminifera in that case, making up the sand. Now, this is actually very, very cool. I mean, basically, half of our ocean is covered with skeletal remains in the grassilian. Now, what actually happens here on those ones is, as I explained already, each of those organisms originally contained organic molecules. Each of them, predominantly being some sort of carbon molecules or another, and of course under conditions where there is sustained pressure and then burial, they can form gas and oil deposits, which we now extract from the deep ocean. Right, here's a curious one. I always wonder why people go off and buy very, very expensive Himalayan rock salt. If you really, really want to do a low carbon, footprint, go and make your own salt. Take a bucket of water and boil it down, preferably using some solar powered system, of course, and you have then a perfect evaporite. And we use this in salt pans the world over. You basically have a shallow swimming pool, a meter deep. I actually made, my very first salary came from working for half a year in a salt pan. Very, very curious. And the odd thing is, nobody would actually eat any of that biosalt if they see what actually comes out from it, because lots of animals actually fall into it and they just get mummified like baboons, antelopes, kind of like that. Well, not quite like that, but you get the drift. And here we actually see some gypsum, being crystallizing out on a rock. But and that actually happens in lagoons which dry up. Lots of the gypsum deposits in the world come, from those kind of very, very hot areas. However, the coolest ones come from the Pacific. Now, about 30 or 40 years ago, on the first dives in sort of the central Pacific between Hawaii and over towards Mexico, people stumbled across those weird potato-looking things on the seafloor. Now, that was not an Irish ship which lost its cargo, or the black potatoes. They covered a size, probably the size of Australia. Now this is very, very odd, and what actually happens is, under those particular chemical conditions in the central Pacific, central north eastern Pacific there, we have precipitation of minerals in a very, very unique makeup. They come either in the form of those nodules, or they come in the form of a crust forming over the top of those seamounts, those mountains. And they're called polymetallic nodules or polymetallic crusts. And the curious thing is, A, how widespread they are, and B, how valuable they are. Now, when I actually started to talk to geologists, and we did some work there, as you can see, not terribly long ago, 2014, feels much longer now, but basically they said this is a mining person's dream to come through. They contain all the rare minerals, particularly used in very advanced metal fabrication, which are usually very, very hard to find. So that process concentrates them in the deep sea. Here's one of those polymetallic nodules. They used to call manganese nodules, but they basically contain all sort of minerals which everybody wants. Now, that came out, I think, this year or last year. And we used to talk about those things not terribly long ago. 5 years ago, people said like, oh yeah, one day, we might actually go and mine some of those things. We might mine some of those, vent chimneys, and they're right in our neighborhood by Australian companies. Or you might go off and basically do the cobalt-rich crusts, right? Or the polymetallic nodules, whatever it may be. And technology is so rapidly advancing that now we actually are in a situation to having to decide who actually has the exploitation right, and how can we have a little bit of an influence of actually making sure it is not complete wanton environmental destruction. And that's the same problem we have actually on the land with terrestrial dry mining. Now, and this is actually no secret, you can actually go on the website of the International Seabed Authority, and this map comes straight from there. And it is astonishing that we as a global society have already started to hand out mining leases, right, to countries in what is called the Clarion Clipperton fracture zone. This is where most of the polymetallic nodules sit. And what is really, really amazing is you can see it sits completely in international waters. This belongs to the US, this is Hawaii, this is Kiribati, this is Mexico. And basically it is the United Nations task, particularly the international, more specifically, the International Seabed Authority, to regulate the use of natural resources on what we call the high seas. Now the high seas happen to be, everything which lies outside the exclusive economic zone. Now what is quite curious here is that the environmental areas, all sit outside the prime mining area. And of course it is a bit like saying, I make a national park somewhere, but not quite really where it actually should be. i.e. every conservation area should have as one of its criterions the need to be representative, right? And if I actually talk about things being thousands of kilometers on either side, it is probably fair to say, and this is what our work has shown on the polymetallic crust on seamounts, that essentially almost every seamount is different in terms of its biological makeup. So this is actually very, very curious. It's actually saying, where are we actually putting spatial conservation zones in? But they're all outside the mining leases. So what is also interesting is this was sort of the images you saw probably 10 years ago, and you could actually get them from textbooks or you get them from various websites. Now the companies are much more brazen, and they have almost promotional videos because the mining will happen. And it's quite interesting to see that here we have a very, very large weapons manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, who builds the Joint Fight Striker, basically working for the UK government, or under, I think, the permission of the UK government. So like, look, this is what we're going to do. So watch this. I leave this really to you before we move on to basically make up your own mind. Of course, it's a promotional video, but what actually is important, that it is something most people don't know, and yet it's actually publicly and brazenly out there.
UK Seabed Resources, a wholly owned subsidiary of Lockheed Martin UK, will assemble a deep seabed manganese nodule recovery and processing system using low-risk, commercially available equipment and technology. The company will draw on its parent company Lockheed Martin to leverage the system architecture from the 1980s. This was, in part, developed and proven via a Lockheed-led consortium in the 1970s, which invested $500 million. In addition to operational seabed experience, the 1970s work also resulted in the discovery of thousands of geolocated nodule mineral samples. Here we see a potential scenario based on applying modern technology to bring forward the legacy Lockheed Martin system. Other alternatives will be evaluated in line with exploration results and environmental considerations, which are paramount. Efficient seabed-to-surface nodule recovery could be achieved by multiple deep-sea nodule collectors, slurry transfer lines and pump, and state-of-the-art riser pipes. This process would deliver nodules to a surface ship, from where they will be transported to a metallurgical processing plant. Multiple nodule collectors, scooping the nodules from the sea floor and transferring them as slurry to the central pump, will be at the heart of the system. Equipment of similar 100-ton size is already operational today for deep-sea cable trenching and pipe laying. Deep-sea vehicles already available can also be employed to connect the collectors to the central pump. The multiple collectors and central slurry pump together provide a constant flow of nodules through the riser pipe to the surface. On board the surface ship, the nodule slurry is pumped to dynamically position bulk carriers for shipment to shore. The nodule slurry is pumped from the ore carrier into temporary storage ponds. In the processing plant, well-established metallurgical processing techniques are used to recover the valuable metals from the nodules. The byproduct is rich in rare earths, which are in demand for high-tech applications, and also in manganese, a key component in steel production. UK Seabed Resources holds rights giving it access to parts of Lockheed Martin's collection of geolocated nodule samples and library of exploration data. This has been gained from across the Clarion-Clipperton zone and provides a unique understanding of the manganese nodule resource. Modern technology and processing methods enable UK Seabed Resources to implement environmentally responsible, commercially viable solutions, which have the potential to benefit the UK economy for the next 30 years.
So I should say, nothing against the UK. Well, it's not rugby or cricket time yet, but otherwise, you always have to sort of beat the Poms, but never mind. Many countries actually have exploration rights and will actually have very, very similar plans afoot. So this is actually just like a reminder for you to poke you in the side and actually illustrate an issue which unfortunately not terribly many people know about. Right, here we go to the fairy dust. If you have children, you know all about it, particularly girls, so it's real. But it really is quite cool, I actually think, to have between 15 and 30 tons of fairy dust per year laying on Earth is actually a figure I thought, I didn't really think it was actually that much before I actually researched it. And there's in every basically cubic meter of deep ocean sediment, there will be a little bit of that in it. Right, you might say, okay, which sediment type is the most? Well, if you measure it, it depends how you measure it. If you measure it by the area of seafloor covered, and you can actually come up with a map, something like that, it's about half between the ones from the land and the ones made from organisms. The other ones are really just very minute quantities. If you, however, ask yourself, how thick is sediment? How much is there? How high is it piled up at the bottom of the seafloor? I think the answer is truly astonishing. It's kilometers of deep mud. You can actually download this in an incredible high resolution format. The total sediment thickness of the world's oceans and marginal sea map. It's fantastic. I mean, NOAA, we under Trump, it became a sport really for everybody. It was a cheap sport and it was a justified sport to make fun of the United States. But the government agencies of the United States do some really super wonderful work. And one of them is how they make publicly available some of the ocean exploration products. I kind of love it. So you have to give credit where credit is due. And we can spend hours literally just talking about this map. But what really astounds me is look at the scale here at the bottom, right? Thickness in meter, and it goes up to 20 kilometers? That's 20,000 meters of mud high, right? So, and essentially the Gulf of Mexico and here the Bay of Bengal receiving all the sediment coming down from the Himalaya mountains, and of course the Mississippi drains half of the watershed of the USA and Canada. Actually, it was supposed to be my road trip this year, driving in Ford F-250 from the headwaters down to New Orleans, but let's do it next year. We do 2, can't wait. Anyways, and essentially over millions of years, it just filled those basins up. They used to be quite deep, and now it's a muddy pool. Now, if you actually cast your mind back when we talked about the topography of the oceans, the ABC of geological features, we said, well, the continental crust sticks a little bit out into the ocean, and then it actually drops down deeply. And that slope environment is called the continental shelf, and then the slope and the rise. Now, not surprisingly, most ocean sediments that came from the land start to accumulate here. Some of them actually, the clay particles, they go all the way out to the middle of the Pacific, but basically down here, we're talking about 8 to 9 kilometers on average of mud. I think that is just astonishing. So the accumulation rate can be up to 1 meter of mud per 1,000 years, which basically you might say this is not terribly much, but in geological times, that's just massive. It's just extraordinary. And of course, if you look around this chart of the oceans, you can actually see, well, where does it come from? It's the major rivers, the Mississippi, the Orinoco, the Amazon, the Mar del Plata, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and then of course a little bit here in Europe. This is actually stuff which came off from the Sahara. You can actually see it, right? Here it actually comes out from the Niger River. Comes out actually from the Namib Desert, and that's the Congo. Hey, Australia, has anybody ever noticed that we seem to be in a permanent drought, and hence our contribution to sediment around is nothing red? Okay, fair enough. So essentially, if you go very deep, very far away from land, of course, it gets less and less. The Atlantic has about double as much on average, simply because it's surrounded by more land in closer proximity, and there's more rivers flowing into it. Also in the Pacific, if you recall, you got this big ocean trenches sitting just basically offshore from Japan, then going on an island arc over Fiji, Tonga, coming down towards New Zealand, the Tonga-Kermadec Trench, and then we got the big Chile Trench just off Chile. So all of those actually, act as a gigantic sediment trap before it actually has a chance to move out into the middle of the Pacific. Still, there is quite a lot out there. Now, let's have a quick look at some of those ocean biogenic sediments. There's a little bit of very fine clay which can travel thousands of kilometers, and that covers a big area, but it's often not very thick. But still, no part of the ocean is ever isolated from the influence of land. Let's just be clear about that. So when people say, it's in the middle of the Pacific, no. Everything is actually ultimately connected in one biosphere. But what really is the cool thing are the oozes. And it's very, very hard to explain what the feeling is when you first get your hands into deep sea mud, which is made from oozes. It really is oozy. It's also very cold, usually like 4 degrees, or even colder, but it really is this kind of oozy material. It's kind of slushy, but it feels kind of nice at the same time, although it's very, very sharp and your fingers swell up because all the little skeletal material goes in. And it accumulates at a great rate of up to 6 centimeters per 1,000 years. Now, that is actually an astonishing rate, and it's all dead organisms in the Gracillion falling down from the sunlit areas. Now, you might come across, those kind of terms, whether it's a calcareous ooze or a siliceous ooze, and it basically just means ooh. easier skeleton made from limestone, then you have one of those culprits here. Or is it made from glass, then you have one of those culprits here. Now, forams can be very large. We talk about pteropods in a second, and coccolithophores. Radiolarians are basically tiny little phytoplankton cells of sorts, I have to say, made from glass, and so are diatoms. And here, those are the skeletal structures of sponges. But it's mostly radiolarians and diatoms when it comes to the glass-like, oozes, and forams, pteropods, and coccolithophores when it comes to the limestone ones. Now, what are those strange animals here? Now, here's radiolarians, and before we get to one of my favorite animals, next time you have a chance and you go to a Pacific island and go there. I mean, it's the most loveliest of people, and they really need every singular tourist dollar. I shouldn't really say don't go to Bali or don't go to France, but I think if you really want to make a difference, I think, to people's real livelihoods, go to some of the Pacific islands. I lived for 2 years in Fiji. It's quite astonishing, and you do not actually realize how far, if you spend it wisely on some of the smaller islands and you stay with locals, how far every tourist dollar goes in terms of educating their kids and buying medical supplies, that kind of stuff. Just when the borders open again, go. And then buy as many cocktails from the locals as you possibly can, basically wet behind your gills. Or beers, or orange juice, or mineral water. Don't buy coconut water unless it comes from a small grove, but never mind. And as you actually put your hand into the sand here, you might actually notice it's actually a lot coarser than is on our beaches here. And have a close look. Often it is coarse because it's made up of gigantic one-celled organisms. Those are some of the largest cells you can find in the plant and animal kingdom. It's a bit of a debate whether unicellular organisms should go, but I think that's irrelevant really. And there can be stars, or there can be those little, almost look like rice. But quite often actually you find these big discs, and it's a single organism, and they make up the sediments on those South Pacific islands. Just something to do. If you have no romantic date on this beach, you might as well study foraminifera. It's quite sad being a marine biologist, so the date, you can always look at foraminifera. Yes, here we go. Right, on that sad note, and look how big they are. This is actually a matchstick here. I think it's fantastic, and you can have star sand and blah blah blah. But when I very first deep sea sample, I put my hands into the mud, and then the next morning I could hardly move my finger. They were like big German sausages, and millions of little, basically, spines buried themselves because they all broke off as I handled the mud. Like those things broke off, and then you get little inflammations and stuff like this, which is lovely on a boat in the middle of the Pacific. But never mind. And I thought, where the hell does this come from? And they come from what I think must be my favorite animals. They're called the sea butterflies or the sea angels. Now, the sea butterflies are like this. And it's actually this translucent animal. It's quite large. And you think, like, what the hell could it possibly be? You see them occasionally. And you see there's a little bit of dark structure here. It's probably the stomach of the animal, so it just ate something. But all of that is just like this floating. And it's not a jellyfish. So what could it possibly be? Now, I'm not clicking on this one. It is, simply because of copyright reasons, so it doesn't upload onto YouTube. You got the link in your lecture notes. Or just Google sea angels. It's fantastic. Now what actually happened is, you can actually see it from this particular fellow here. You can see the remnant of a shell. It's a very small, very translucent, very fine, very delicate shell, because it has to be very light. Because there's a group of snails who decided I completely had it just being this kind of snail thing. You know, I'm kind of slimy, I got a bit of a shell at the top which is quite heavy. Sometimes the French come along and they stuff me, you know, with some garlic, you know, behind their gills and drink red wine and eat baguettes with it. But this whole snail business is just really, really mundane. It's very pedestrian. So I want to actually be free. I want to be like a bird in the ocean. I want to be like a fish. I want to be like, you know, something beautiful. So evolution has kind of, you know, the evolution theory has kind of listened to the pleas for being a little bit more glamorous, or a lot more glamorous. And what actually happened was they transformed their foot into wings. Here we go. That's what I call pteropods. The winged feet, so to speak. They reduced the shell, but that little bit of shell which remained is the skeletal remains which sink to the bottom of the ocean and make those oozes, which can be very, very prickly. But the really cool thing is it's actually snails flying through the water. I mean, you can't get any cooler in zoology. I think they are the number one cool invertebrate. And go and Google on YouTube pteropods or sea angels or sea butterflies. I think it's fantastic. And look at this guy. I mean, the colors, and then he developed his little arms, and there's a little jaw. I mean, compared to, you know, any other marine snail, this is like cool stuff. Now, going from the really, you know, aesthetically incredibly pleasing stuff to that. Now, when we still could lecture in big lecture theatres, I said, no, what is that? And people said, no, I'm not quite sure. And there would always be one or two kids who are not all that polite. And I would say, that's a turd. And yes, it is. It's actually named a fecal pellet, which is a very curious term, a fecal pellet, but it's basically a turd. And it's about 300 micrometers long. So it's a lot bigger than really the little tiny fragments of phytoplankton which it contains. And it's a turd from those kind of animals called copyboats. Now they really actually are that colorful, you know, if you put them under the microscope. And it is said, there's something like Jeremy Clarkson would say on Top Gun, it is said that, you know, the Tyler Lama only has one pair of underpants, or something like this, something ridiculous he always says on Top Gear, or what is it now, the Grand Voyage. That one particular species of copyboat, that tiny little crustaceans in the plankton, floating in the top layers of the ocean, is the most numerous species of multicellular animals in the world. So there's tons of them. And they're grazing on the phytoplankton cells, including those which have skeletons which make sediments when they have died. And so what actually happens is we go from the skeletal remains like this. This is like a big, big circular diatom. And that's actually magnified from one of those turds. And remember what I said, it would take 50 years for that surface carbon to go from the top to the bottom of the ocean. But if you have the copyboats packaging it into larger particles, i.e. this one, politely called fecal pellets, the whole process is actually sped up considerably. And this is a really cool mechanism. Tiny little crustaceans feeding on phytoplankton. Phytoplankton that absorbs carbon dioxide after it has been dissolved in the seawater, of course, make organic molecules which feed the copyboats and then sink to the bottom of the ocean, much of it where it actually gets buried. This is the true carbon removal pump of the biosphere. It's not like planting forests and offsetting them, and this is all. Of course, that doesn't work because the trees rot again, and just basically when they rot, the bacteria give off CO2. this is actually what does work. And oddly enough, a key process is a dirty one. However, I can't leave you with that kind of impression, so I leave you with a few drawings of those copy boats. And this is not a guy who actually has, discovered a new drug supplier of some really, really cool stuff. This is a German illustrator at the turn of the last century, and he really actually saw copy boats exquisitely like that. So there is beauty in turd producing crustaceans in the middle of the world's oceans, making marine sediments. On that bombshell, I see you shortly with another topic.